Hi everyone, my name is Verena Distler and I'm a researcher at the University of Luxembourg. Today I am presenting our work titled A Systematic Literature Review of Empirical Methods and Risk Representation in Usable Privacy and Security Research. I am presenting today also on behalf of my co-authors from University of Luxembourg, Carnegie Mellon University, SIS by Helmholtz Center for Information Security, and Eindhoven University of Technology. When using technology, people are exposed to a large number and type of security and privacy risks, and we hear reports of successful security breaches almost daily. It is important to understand how people perceive and understand these risks, and to study their reactions to potential security attacks. This can help design interventions that will help people better understand and respond to risks and attacks. For researchers designing a study, it is difficult to recreate a realistic experience of security and privacy risks in a research context. Researchers need to navigate trade-offs between realistic risk representation, ethical and legal concerns, and also consider logistical and privacy-related concerns at the same time. These are just some of the challenges that researchers in usable privacy and security face when designing user studies. In light of these challenges, we investigated which methods researchers use for privacy and security studies that include human participants, with a particular focus on the approaches researchers use to represent risk. We had three research objectives. First, we wanted to understand which methods researchers in the usable privacy and security community used. Second, we investigated how researchers represented risk to research participants. Third, we wanted to understand how researchers in the UPS community use deception in their user study protocols. To address these objectives, we conducted a systematic literature review of papers from 5 top-tier UPS venues, and we used search terms that combine security and privacy-related terms with user-related terms. From an initial sample of 633 papers, we systematically selected 284 full-length papers that included human subject studies. We provide the dataset as supplemental material. We then analyzed this set of papers and we focused on study methods, risk representation, the use of prototypes, scenarios, educational interventions, the use of deception to simulate risk, and types of participants. I will now present a subset of results, but we invite you to read the paper for a full picture of the selection and analysis procedure and the results. To describe the set of analyzed papers, most of the papers had an experimental or descriptive objective, with only few relational studies. The most common study methods were experiments, interviews, and surveys. For participant recruitment, researchers frequently relied on crowdsourcing and non-representative convenience samples. Risk representation in the analyzed papers was mostly based on naturally occurring or simulated risk, varying with study methods and research objectives of the paper. An example for what we analyzed as naturally occurring risk would be when researchers sent a password reset email to actual LinkedIn users and evaluated the effectiveness. Another example was when researchers introduced threat modeling in an enterprise setting. The risk is not simulated for the purpose of the research. Instead, it is naturally occurring. An example for simulated risk representation would be an online experiment where the researchers asked participants to imagine that they were creating a password for an account that they cared a lot about, such as their primary email account. Another example is when developers were asked to role-play and imagine that they were responsible for creating the code for user registration. In our sample, there were few studies that relied only on mentioned risk or that did not represent risk at all. It might seem surprising that there are studies that do not attempt to create a perception of privacy and security risk. These were typically studies that focused only on the usability of a privacy or security tool, without attempting to recreate a perception of risk. Researchers used creative combinations of approaches to represent risk to research participants. For example, assigned tasks, prototypes, scenarios, deception, educational interventions, or incentives for secure behavior. We give many examples of how researchers use these approaches in the paper. For now, let's have a closer look at deception. In the paper, we describe how there is a gray area between deception and not priming participants to think about security and privacy topics, which we did not classify as deception. We thought that researchers might frequently use deception to simulate risk, but surprisingly, we found that deception was used only in about 5% of papers. We categorize these papers to understand what type of deception they used. Most commonly, these papers deceive participants about the objective of the study, others deceive participants about the presence of risk, and some deceive their participants about the study participation. In the paper, we give examples and provide a much more detailed analysis of papers using deception. In the paper, we discuss the choice of methods and risk representation. Overall, the choice of method usually coincided with certain types of risk representation. When picking a method, researchers will thus often face trade-offs with regards to the risk representation they can possibly use in their study design. We also point to methods that might be underexploited, for example diary studies, vignette studies, and studies involving groups of people, for example focus groups or workshops. In terms of participant recruitment, we found that certain populations were understudied. When they were included, it was usually in descriptive studies, and not to assess the suitability of security or privacy tools for these populations. We also discussed the use of crowd workers in the sample. With regards to ethics, we discussed the use of deception. Authors use different definitions for deception, and the community might profit from further discussion of what types of deception are ethically acceptable in UPS studies, and under which circumstances. A small number of studies also used attackers as non-consenting human subjects, which might also warrant more discussion. To analyze how researchers represent risk to their participants, it is essential to have a clear understanding of how the authors recruited participants, what the participants were told or led to believe, and how tasks or questions were framed. In some of the papers we reviewed, these details were not clear, and we provide a checklist and guidelines to help report the relevant details for better replicability and understandability of how researchers induced a perception of risk. Thank you. I encourage you to read the paper for more details.